You are listening to Stranger Than Fiction, Corruption and Crimes Against Humanity in the COVID Era, an audiobook by N.B. Austin. This is a free audiobook, but if you enjoy what you're listening to, you'd like to cut ahead quicker, you'd like to have access to all the citations, it's also available in ebook and paperback on Amazon. Even if reading is not quite your thing and you prefer to listen, buying a copy is a great way to support and is much appreciated. Finally, be sure to like, subscribe, share with friends and family, and most importantly, if you do buy a book, leave a review on Amazon. All of the above help tremendously in getting this information out there and turning the tide on medical tyranny. Now, without further ado, let's begin with Chapter 9, Treatments, Part 2, Early Treatment, Compassionate Care. We've now covered the dangerous, expensive medications and treatment procedures which have made up the public health strategy during the COVID era. We've touched on how these practices, in many cases, caused the very death and side effects those responsible attributed without satisfactory evidence to a novel coronavirus. But this is not to imply that people who were given those bad treatments were not ill in some fashion beforehand. They obviously were, in my opinion, with a variety of illnesses, as we saw with comedian Jim Breuer's not COVID patient friend. At the same time, my intention with this book is not to be doom and gloom. The events and actions described are extremely dark and do warrant some form of justice be done. But I've found that simply having the historical and situational background can help arm you against the lies enough to resist them, with or without the criminals being put before an earthly court. And maybe one day that background might even be shared with the right person in the right position of authority to act. This is why many alternative media outlets described this time as a choice everyone had to make: the Great Reset or the Great Awakening. Electing the path of awakening myself, I find myself ironically grateful for the irrational, hardline stance public health departments took toward pushing those bad treatments. Their having been so obvious about it is what made information on alternatives so thirsted for and ultimately attained during the COVID era. This chapter highlights those more effective, safer, more natural treatment and prevention alternatives, as well as the over-the-top efforts to suppress them. The documented benefits of early treatment. As we touched on in the previous chapter, early treatment and prevention outside of hospitals was not a priority for public health departments for the first and most crucial 2 years of the COVID era, with only a half-hearted, dishonest effort pivoted to in 2022. Given our understanding that many diseases and ailments were mischaracterized as COVID during this time period, it should be obvious why this would lead to disaster. Again, we can review the case of Jim Breuer's friend for direct evidence of this problem. We can also validate them via studies which have showed the difference between life and death in effectively all cases came down to whether or not the person received treatment, as if studies would be needed for such an idea. Common sense alone should tell any honest person that the primary encouragements by public health departments should have been healthy behavior, clean eating, exercise, vitamin supplementation, and a sense of calm. Instead, they unfathomably opted for gym closures, masks, antisocial isolation, silence on diet and nutrition, and mass panic. And to underline just how incomprehensible this was, we need simply return our attention to the aforementioned NIH Ebola study, in which the benefits of early treatment are explicitly called out. Not only that, but even as it relates to coronavirus and/or influenza-based illnesses, a 2010 study published by Barrick et al. In PLOS Pathogens found that, quote, increasing the intracellular ZN2+ concentration with zinc ionophores like pyrithione, PT, can efficiently impair the replication of a variety of RNA viruses, end quote. Among the viruses they claimed zinc ionophores inhibited were arterivirus, poliovirus, influenza virus, and, you guessed it, coronavirus. It will come as little surprise then that the early treatments we will cover in this chapter, such as ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and quercetin, all satisfy the criteria of zinc ionophores, which are any chemicals that facilitate the passage of zinc ions through the cell membrane, something elemental zinc cannot do on its own. Several subsequent studies have continued to support the benefits of zinc specifically for the purposes of the diseases referred to as COVID as well. Despite these findings, we can see it inexplicably took Fauci and NIAID until November of 2020 to even acknowledge and recommend research into early treatments, research which had clearly already been done. And even if we pretend it hadn't, how could this not have been the very first priority at the beginning of 2020? Why did it take until a month before the inoculation rollout for this recommendation to be made? That question has a known answer, and it's coming in the next chapter. For now, are we to assume this man simply forgot every single thing he once knew about diseases and treatments? Of course not. It is as impossible to assume that as it is impossible for him to have forgotten. Additionally, despite Fauci's public ass-covering plea for early treatment research in November 2020, he had already ignored plenty of demonstrations of effective early treatment options by prominent physicians. One example, as published in Pulmonary Pharmacology and Therapeutics by Blanco et al., came out of a nursing home in Spain as early as March 2020. The mean age of residents at the home was 85, with 48% over 80 years old. Surely a place where COVID would wreak havoc. Within a few months, 100% of the residents had tested positive, meaning they were all goners, only they weren't goners. Not one resident died or was hospitalized, and all seroconverted showed signs of antibodies. So how did they do it? The answer is early treatment, regardless of symptom severity. And this included simple common treatments like antihistamines, antibiotics, nasal washing, and pain and headache medications. Why hasn't this study been acknowledged to date by the major public health organizations, considering the extraordinary implications? Is it because it's an observational study? The CDC, NIH, and FDA have never shied away from citing observational studies before in the name of supporting their determinations and subsequent actions. Ignoring for a second that these nursing home patients both tested positive for an allegedly novel disease and clearly didn't have one, why wouldn't the NIH recommendations for non-hospitalized patients include these clearly effective, common, low-risk profile treatments as potential options? Is it because the FDA hasn't approved them for use in treating COVID? If so, why hasn't it when it's granted allegedly emergency justified use authorizations to dangerous, high-risk profile, unproven novel drugs? Why wouldn't all common treatments for similar ailments, i.e. the common cold and flu, be granted emergency use authorization for this purpose? One would think in an emergency you'd want more options on the table for treating sick people, not less, especially options known to be safe for similar uses. These are questions which cannot be answered without a response of corruption. But to return to the topic at hand for now, this was not nearly the only example of early treatment benefits to draw from. Another frontline example comes from Dr. Brian Tyson, a California physician who has treated, quote, more than 6,000 COVID patients. Decrying the inhibition of early treatment by public health authorities, Dr. Tyson explains how he simply did what a doctor always does, namely, treating inflammation with anti-inflammatories, treating blood clots with anticoagulants, and treating breathing issues with asthma medications. Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, a prominent New York physician, is another who was on the front line, having treated, quote, thousands of patients, as well as having been cited in over 10 COVID-19 research studies and conducting several of his own studies. Dr. Zelenko primarily seems to recommend hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, more on that later, having had a role in the treatment of President Donald Trump. He also stresses the benefits of prevention with his Z-Stack protocol, however, with the emphasis placed on quercetin, zinc, vitamin C, and vitamin D. The benefits of quercetin and vitamin D in particular are supported in an increasing number of peer-reviewed studies related to the diseases called COVID. Another example of successful early treatment protocols comes from the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, the FLCCC, which developed the iMask Plus Prevention and Early Treatment Protocol. The FLCCC points out that all medications are FDA approved, though not for COVID, inexpensive, readily available, and have been used for decades with well-established safety profiles. The protocol includes antivirals, mouthwashes, nasal sprays, nutritional recommendations, and vitamin recommendations such as vitamin D3, vitamin C, quercetin, zinc, and melatonin. One would think the FDA, CDC, WHO, or NIH would have similar documentation for simple things a person can do to treat and or prevent similar illness, but they do not, nor do they endorse the FLCCC protocol. In fact, according to the CDC, quote, those at highest risk for severe disease and death include those with underlying conditions including but not limited to obesity, hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory or kidney disease, immunosuppression from solid organ transplant, and sickle cell disease, end quote. Also, they acknowledge that, quote, for only 6% of deaths, COVID is the only cause mentioned, and for deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 2.9 additional conditions or causes per death, end quote. Given these conclusions, it seems obvious that if one wanted to avoid a serious case of the cold or flu, aka COVID, to anyone who still insists on referring to all illnesses as that, one should maybe do the general nutritional maintenance type things mentioned in the iMask Plus protocol. Up until this tragic point, this included things like maintaining a healthy, natural diet and supplementing vitamins and nutrients if necessary. Unfortunately, however, along with such basic healthy activities as working out and breathing, the benefits of these things too were considered exaggerated and certainly insufficient by both public health organizations and their propagandist media PR teams as it related to COVID. This was because the only thing worth focusing on, the thing everyone would have to take in order to save the day, was gene therapy inoculations, and there was no substitute which would suffice. The antivirals the iMask Plus protocol recommends are ivermectin, more on that shortly, and nitazoxanide. This also made me reflect on the situation I mentioned earlier when I was denied care at an urgent care clinic despite ultimately having been found to have had a parasite. Once accurately diagnosed, I was prescribed nitazoxanide. Like ivermectin, nitazoxanide is considered an antiparasitic, which apparently also has antiviral properties. The reason I'd been denied care at the urgent clinic is because along with not being tested for COVID, I had a mild cough alongside my ongoing diarrhea symptoms. So my problem with this situation, beyond my having been discriminated against, is this. I knew not to get a COVID test because I knew they were nonsense. If I had gotten one, though, which I now in hindsight almost wish I had just to conduct this experiment, I almost certainly would have tested positive, as some of my friends who got tested at that time did. And I would have tested positive despite the fact that my ailment was actually related to a parasite. So, given the inclusion of something like diarrhea as a symptom of COVID, the fact that doctors can diagnose a COVID case based on these symptoms per the CDC, and the fact that parasite treatments can also be used for viral infections, this serves as just another example of how incredibly likely misdiagnosis was made thanks to the intervention of these organizations in the doctor-patient relationship. I also wonder what would have happened to me, what has happened to many unfortunate others, if I'd have been ignorant enough of the situation to have originally gotten the test as the urgent care recommended, gone to a hospital thinking I had a scary new disease that wouldn't go away, and had been treated with the recommended treatments in the prior chapter. I shudder to think. I am grateful to the doctors out there who helped prevent that outcome, many of whom have done everything they can to share their findings. Alongside Dr. Corey, Dr. George Fareed, Dr. Stephen Hatfill, and Dr. Peter McCullough each presented on the issue of early treatment and its suppression to the Italian Senate in the fall of 2021. This is just one example, as many others have spoken out to from the beginning in various avenues. Despite their calls for adoption of early treatment as an official policy going unanswered in favor of experimental drugs and gene therapy inoculations, the impact they had in sharing what they know about providing care, as a doctor is meant to, undoubtedly saved many lives. The slander of ivermectin and the assault on the doctor-patient relationship. On October 5, 2015, just 4 years prior to the outbreak of the alleged pandemic, NBC reported on 3 scientists having won the Nobel Prize of Medicine. Their names were William C. Campbell, Satoshi Omura, and Yu Tu, and their award-winning accomplishment was discovering natural-based remedies against parasites that cause malaria and river blindness. The compounds they discovered were called artemisinin and ivermectin, which NBC claimed have been, quote, used by millions of people around the world and have saved countless lives. They went on to highlight that ivermectin specifically, quote, now is used to fight pests from bedbugs and lice to serious diseases such as lymphatic filariasis, and was derived from naturally occurring bacteria in soil. NBC also acknowledged the Nobel Committee's lauding of the discovery as well, saying, quote, these 2 discoveries have provided humankind with powerful new means to combat these debilitating diseases that affect hundreds of millions of people annually. The consequences in terms of improved human health and reduced suffering are immeasurable, end quote. Fast forward to August 2021 when the same NBC characterized the same ivermectin. Quote, ivermectin, a drug primarily used to deworm animals, end quote. This despite the fact that not one time in the 2015 article did NBC mention ivermectin's use in animals. They did connect artemisinin to use in animals. In fact, I took the time to count, and they referenced the, quote, immeasurable benefits specifically for, in their own words, humans, humankind, people, and children 9 times in 15 total paragraphs. This is not to say ivermectin is not used in animals. It is, and clearly has an exceptional variety of benefits. The primary issue here, though, is this is just another example of the exceptional dishonesty and passive-aggressive unprofessionalism with which the U.S. propagandist media and public health institutions carry themselves. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Also in August of 2021, the US FDA's Twitter page went as far as to post the following in reference to ivermectin. Quote, you are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it. End quote. Well, gee willikers, y'all. The FDA sure is hip and totally not speaking down to millions of people. Just take it from acting FDA Commissioner Janet Woodcock speaking on the post. Quote, that was great. Even I saw it. End quote. Did you hear that? Even the FDA director saw what is said on the FDA's official social media page. Another senior FDA official also concurred with Woodcock on how, quote, great it was, calling it a, quote, unique viral moment in a time of incredible misinformation. There's that word again, that lazy, unscientific word. And unsurprisingly, it was not said without a heaping smack of hubris to follow. You see, the data this tweet used as its justification came from a Mississippi Health Department poison control alert. According to Mary Beth Pfeiffer and Linda Bonvie, publishing for Rescue with Michael Capuzzo, Freedom of Information Act emails would reveal this data was not only not vetted by the FDA, but was even still viewed as a, quote, opportunity to remind the public of our warnings for ivermectin. As much as I hate the word, this is misinformation by its very definition. It is also a gross, though at this point expected, failure of duty and demonstration of incompetence. The same incompetence ravages the mainstream media, which also jumped all over the story. As they did in lockstep narrative consistency, as with every story ever, music magazine turned propaganda rag Rolling Stone wrote of Oklahoma hospitals so jammed with ivermectin overdoses that gunshot victims had to wait for care. As if the story was even remotely believable to begin with, even the Washington Post admitted that it was simply false, as they acknowledged for Rolling Stone it must have been, quote, too good to check. But don't mistakenly think WAPO is innocent either. Along with the Associated Press, New York Times, and The Guardian, WAPO also had to correct their own reporting on the Mississippi story. As for the New York Times, they outright lied, referring in their own piece to a, quote, staggering number of calls before printing corrections, which have become a staple for them. And before we continue, let me just reiterate that these are the same organizations which constantly use the word misinformation and declare it a problem which can apparently only be corrected by listening to them. Staggering. So what actually happened in Mississippi which led to this dumpster fire? A now corrected health alert did go out, which read, quote, at least 70% of the recent calls have been related to ingestion of livestock or animal formulations of ivermectin purchased at livestock supply centers. End quote. What the media failed to ask, however, is 70% of what? The alert now clarifies of ivermectin-related calls, as opposed to of all poison control calls, as the FDA and media insinuated without checking. The total of ivermectin-related calls was also only 14. In fact, the other 30% of the 14 were strictly informational calls, and of the 70% who called about ingesting the horse dewormer version of ivermectin, only one had worse than mild symptoms. Examples like these of childish mainstream media and public health slander related to ivermectin abounded in the COVID era. Another prominent one which seemed to go viral was the experience of podcaster and comedian Joe Rogan, who took the human version of ivermectin when sick. Rogan recovered shortly after, but was slandered by CNN and countless other outlets as having taken horse dewormer anyway. CNN is even accused of having gone as far as to alter a video of a post-ivermectin Rogan to make him look pale and sickly. Rogan later had the chance to question leading CNN medical personality Sanjay Gupta, who did not seem to have an answer for why his network lied about Rogan's medication, which he claimed was prescribed to him by a doctor. While it is and has been a huge problem that the US mainstream media lies seemingly all the time, there is an equally troubling problem presented here, which has become more prominent in the COVID era. The problem this case study demonstrates is that none of these people, not the FDA nor the mainstream media, actually treat patients, yet they have the audacity to slander natural, potentially life-saving treatments which are being prescribed by doctors for people with the symptoms related to COVID. Though it seems to have been forgotten thanks to their hellish propaganda, this is a role reserved for the discretion of a medical doctor in relationship with that doctor's patient. And the sabotage of the doctor-patient relationship during this COVID era has not gone unnoticed by the doctors themselves. One unfathomable example is Dr. Robert Karras of Arkansas, who was reportedly being investigated by the Arkansas State Medical Board for his use of ivermectin to treat his patients. As far as what's reported is concerned, it seems the only apparent justification for this investigation was the CDC and FDA's absurd propaganda related to ivermectin's alternative use as a horse medication. According to Dr. Karras, quote, "In my medical judgment, weighing the known risks and side effect profile of ivermectin against the potential benefits supports the administration of ivermectin. I do not have the luxury of conducting my own clinical trial or study and am not attempting to do so. I am on the front lines trying to prevent death and serious illness. I am proud of our track record in both of my clients and at the jail in particular, where not one single patient of the 500 plus who have followed our plan of care has been hospitalized, intubated, or died." End quote. Another example of the same issue came out of Alberta, Canada, where Dr. Daniel Nagase reportedly received a warning by Alberta Health Services for treating patients with ivermectin. Dr. Nagase claimed these health officials were, quote, "withholding a life-saving medication from an entire province." Predictably, the warning he apparently received cited both the slanderous hollow term misinformation as well as the slanderous talking point of ivermectin as a veterinary medication. The frustrations of Dr. Karras and Nagase were also echoed at a global COVID summit held in Rome, Italy, where a physician's declaration was announced by the International Alliance of Physicians and Medical Scientists. The declaration, which as of October 22, 2021 had been signed by more than 12,700 doctors and scientists, both recognizes the, quote, "assault on our ability to care for our patients," as well as reaffirming the commitment to the Hippocratic Oath. The declaration reads as follows, quote, "We, the physicians of the world, united and loyal to the Hippocratic Oath, recognizing the profession of medicine as we know it is at a crossroad, are compelled to declare the following. Whereas it is our utmost responsibility and duty to uphold and restore the dignity, integrity, art, and science of medicine. Whereas there is an unprecedented assault on our ability to care for our patients. Whereas public policymakers have chosen to force a one-size-fits-all treatment strategy resulting in needless illness and death, rather than upholding fundamental concepts of the individualized, personalized approach to patient care which has proven to be safe and more effective. Whereas physicians and other healthcare providers working on the front lines, utilizing their knowledge of epidemiology, pathophysiology, and pharmacology are often first to identify new potentially life-saving treatments. Whereas physicians are increasingly being discouraged from engaging in open professional discourse and the exchange of ideas about new and emerging diseases, not only endangering the essence of the medical profession, but more importantly, more tragically, the lives of our patients. Whereas thousands of physicians are being prevented from providing treatment to their patients as a result of barriers put up by pharmacies, hospitals, and public health agencies, rendering the vast majority of healthcare providers helpless to protect their patients in the face of disease. Physicians are now advising their patients to simply go home, allowing the virus to replicate, and return when their disease worsens, resulting in hundreds of thousands of unnecessary patient deaths due to failure to treat. Whereas this is not medicine, this is not care, these policies may actually constitute crimes against humanity. Now, therefore, it is resolved that the physician-patient relationship must be restored. The very heart of medicine is this relationship, which allows physicians to best understand their patients and their illnesses to formulate treatments to give the best chance for success while the patient is an active participant in their care. Resolved that the political intrusion into the practice of medicine and the physician-patient relationship must end. Physicians and all healthcare providers must be free to practice the art and science of medicine without fear of retribution, censorship, slander, or disciplinary action, including possible loss of licensure and hospital privileges, loss of insurance contracts, and interference from government entities and organizations, which further prevent us from caring for patients in need. More than ever, the right and ability to exchange objective scientific findings, which further our understanding of disease, must be protected. Resolved that patients must defend their right to prescribe treatment, observing the tenet, first, do no harm. Physicians shall not be restricted from prescribing safe and effective treatments. These restrictions continue to cause unnecessary sickness and death. The rights of patients, after being fully informed about the risks and benefits of each option, must be restored to receive those treatments. Resolved that we invite physicians of the world and all healthcare providers to join us in this noble cause as we endeavor to restore trust, integrity, and professionalism to the practice of medicine. Resolved that we invite the scientists of the world who are skilled in biomedical research and uphold the highest ethical and moral standards to insist on their ability to conduct and publish objective empirical research without fear of reprisal upon their careers, reputations, and livelihoods. And resolved that we invite patients who believe in the importance of the physician-patient relationship and the ability to be active participants in their care to demand access to science-based medical care. End quote. The truth about ivermectin. Quote, don't do it. There's no evidence whatsoever that that works, and it could potentially have toxicity, as you just mentioned, with people who have gone to poison control centers because they've taken the drug at a ridiculous dose and wind up getting sick. There's no clinical evidence that indicates that this works. End quote. Anthony Fauci on ivermectin in a CNN interview, August 29, 2021. This quote by Anthony Fauci in August of 2021 is particularly ironic considering his own organization, the NIH, changed its stance on ivermectin as a treatment for COVID in January of 2021 from against to neutral. It was also made in response to the CNN anchor prompting it by specifically referencing the Mississippi Poison Control Center story we already determined to have been a gross exaggeration. This means Fauci is either lying or totally incompetent in this case, a familiar story to be sure. Either way, it is this type of incessant slander and suppression of real information on ivermectin, a potentially life-saving treatment by Fauci and people in positions like his, that constitutes a crime against humanity, one of the many we've listed to this point. And despite the claims Fauci admits through his actions are false, the vast majority of doctors and studies seem to point to ivermectin as an effective treatment for these types of flu-like symptoms. Before we address the litany of studies mentioned, let's look at the potential toxicity risks of ivermectin, of which Fauci, the FDA, and the media seem so obnoxiously concerned. A quick search of ivermectin in VigiAccess, the WHO's Adverse Events Drug Monitoring Database, renders 5,697 total reported adverse events from 1992 through October 2021. For context on how incredibly low this total is, a search of Advil, aka generic name ibuprofen, tallied over the same period renders 157,320 total reported adverse events. Does Fauci think Advil should be taken off the counters? And what if we compare ivermectin to the drugs public health did sanction and say were safe and effective? A search of remdesivir yields 7,663 reported results in the less than 2 years since it was EUA approved, with the COVID-19 vaccine at an astounding 2,403,506 reported results in the same less than 2 year period, but way more on that to come. Where's the FDA's snarky tweet about how y'all shouldn't take those never before approved for human being drugs because you're not a guinea pig? So ivermectin's risk profile is clearly one of the least significant of any drug ever. In fact, there seems to be almost no risk at all if one simply refrains from taking more than the prescribed amount, which should be obvious. The next question, though, is does it work to treat the symptoms of COVID? And the answer from countless studies and doctors' experiences seems to be a resounding yes. First, we have a 2021 systemic review, meta-analysis, and trial sequential analysis to inform clinical guidelines on ivermectin for prevention and treatment of COVID-19 infection by Bryant et al. In the American Journal of Therapeutics. In this report, the authors reviewed 24 randomized controlled trials involving 3,406 participants. Their conclusions were as follows. Quote, moderate certainty evidence finds that large reductions in COVID-19 deaths are possible using ivermectin. Using ivermectin early in the clinical course may reduce numbers progressing to severe disease. The apparent safety and low cost suggest that ivermectin is likely to have a significant impact on the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic globally. End quote. This analysis obviously provides a dark context to Fauci's quote of no clinical evidence supporting ivermectin. But the story behind this paper gets much more disturbing. On the heels of its release, one of the authors, Dr. Tess Lowry, reached out to fellow researcher Dr. Andrew Hill about joining a team to do an additional systemic review. According to Lowry, Hill agreed and was all in on ivermectin, having testified to an NIH panel about the benefits of the drug on January 6, 2021. In fact, Hill was so enthusiastic about ivermectin, he went as far as to publicly say the following, quote, I'll give you an example. My brother, he's 58, he's a smoker, and if he was hospitalized with COVID-19, I don't know that there isn't a way to get supplies of ivermectin into the UK. If I could, and I knew it was good quality, I would want my brother to be taking it. End quote. Before Hill could join Lowry's team, and less than 2 weeks after his NIH hearing, however, on January 18, 2021, he published a preprint of a paper titled Meta-Analysis of Randomized Trials of Ivermectin to Treat SARS-CoV-2 Infection. This preprint found ivermectin to have several benefits, ultimately recommending larger trials be done. Lowry reached out to Hill, who she acknowledges is not a treating doctor, requesting a retraction of this new paper for its lack of endorsement of ivermectin despite these findings. She then met with him on Zoom the next day. On the call, Lowry called Hill out on an independent communication specialist confirmation that Hill's paper included multiple instances of interference, additional text added to the paper, from what the specialist termed a, quote, shadow author. And while this might seem speculative, it was confirmed by Hill himself on the Zoom call. Quote, Lowry, whose conclusions are those on the review that you've done? Who's not listed as an author who's actually contributed? Hill, well, I don't really want to get into it. Unitaid, Lowry, I think it needs to be clear. I would like to know who are these other voices that are in your paper that are not acknowledged? Does Unitaid have a say? Do they influence what you write? Hill, Unitaid has a say in the conclusions of the paper, yeah. Lowry, okay, so who is it in Unitaid then? Who is giving your opinion on your evidence? Hill, well, it's just the people there. Lowry, I thought Unitaid was just a charity. Is it not a charity so they have a say in your conclusions? Hill, yeah. End quote. Unitaid is an affiliate of the WHO, which describes itself as a, quote, global health agency engaged in finding innovative solutions to prevent, diagnose, and treat diseases more quickly, cheaply, and effectively in low and middle income countries, end quote. Like the WHO, it is funded by both governments and large grants, such as a $50 million contribution from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We will cover the massive conflicts of interest these large grants can lead to in a later chapter. But for now, we can clearly see the result of those conflicts and their admitted influence over Hill, whose study was funded by Unitaid to provide research to the WHO. On January 12, 2021, sandwiched in between Hill's NIH testimony and preprint reversal, Unitaid also happened to award $40 million to the University of Liverpool, where Hill is a senior visiting research fellow in the pharmacology department. Hill's paper was ultimately retracted, not for the scientific fraud he openly admits to having committed, but instead citing concerns claimed to exist with some of the studies the paper reviewed. Still, Hill lists no conflicts of interest of his own in the retraction, despite confessing to his conclusions being dictated by Unitaid. This is the sorry state of the same infallible science which is used as a justification to enact some of the most all-encompassing tyrannies the world has ever seen. It is proof that without a full commitment to morality, actual science and reasonable conclusions are impossible. Andrew Hill's submission is a vile example of the type of void of ethics science which has plagued the COVID era and the practice of the scientific method in general. One of the people who called Hill out for his actions was Dr. Pierre Corey, who both testified with Hill at the January 2021 NIH panel and also on December 8, 2020, before the Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing on medical response to COVID-19 in favor of what he called a miracle repurposed drug. Quote, "I want to start out by saying that I'm not speaking as an individual. I'm speaking on behalf of the organization that I am a part of. We are a group of some of the most highly published physicians in the world. We have near 2,000 peer-reviewed publications among us. You just mentioned that I was here in May and I recommended that it was critical that we use corticosteroids in this disease when all of the national and international healthcare organizations said we cannot use those. That turned out to be a life-saving recommendation. We have now come to the conclusion after 9 months, and I have to point out I am severely troubled by the fact that the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC, I do not know of any task force that was assigned or compiled to review repurposed drugs in an attempt to treat this disease. Everything has been about novel and or expensive pharmaceutically engineered drugs, things like tocilizumab and remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies and vaccines. We have a solution to this crisis. There is a drug that is proving to be of miraculous impact. And when I say miracle, I do not use that term lightly. And I don't want to be sensationalized when I say that. That is a scientific recommendation based on mountains of data that has emerged in the last 3 months. When I am told, and I just heard this in the opening sentence, that we are touting things that are not FDA or NIH recommended, let me be clear. The NIH, their recommendation on ivermectin, which is to not use it outside of controlled trials, is from August 27th. We are now in December. This is 3 to 4 months later. Mountains of data have emerged from many centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. It basically obliterates transmission of this virus. If you take it, you will not get sick." End quote. Those are big claims, but they are also supported claims. In a summary document titled Review of the Emerging Evidence Demonstrating the Efficacy of Ivermectin in the Prophylaxis and Treatment of COVID-19, Dr. Corey and the team he referenced in his speech to the Senate, the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, provide the mountain of evidence he referred to. This mountain includes the following summary of studies and conclusions, among others. Since 2012, at least 8 in vitro studies have demonstrated that ivermectin inhibits the replication of many viruses, including influenza, Zika, dengue, and others. At least 1 study shows ivermectin inhibits SARS-CoV-2 replication and binding to host tissue via several observed and proposed mechanisms. At least 3 studies show ivermectin has potent anti-inflammatory properties, with in vitro data demonstrating profound inhibition of both cytokine production and transcription of nuclear factor Kb, the most potent mediator of inflammation. At least 2 studies show ivermectin significantly diminishes viral load and protects against organ damage in multiple animal models when infected with SARS-CoV-2 or similar coronaviruses. At least 5 studies show ivermectin prevents transmission and development of COVID-19 disease in those exposed to infected patients. At least 9 studies show ivermectin hastens recovery and prevents deterioration in patients with mild to moderate disease treated early after symptoms. At least 7 studies show ivermectin hastens recovery and avoidance of ICU admission and death in hospitalized patients. At least 3 studies show ivermectin reduces mortality in critically ill patients with COVID-19. At least 3 studies show ivermectin leads to striking reductions in case fatality rates in regions with widespread use. At least 1 study shows safety, availability, and cost of ivermectin is nearly unparalleled given its near-zero drug interactions along with only mild and rare side effects observed in almost 40 years of use and billions of doses administered. And finally, the WHO has long included ivermectin on its list of essential medicines. It cannot be said that this evidence went unnoticed by the Congress to which Dr. Corey presented it either. In what can only be described as yet another horrendous scandal if true, the same Congress which seems to have turned a blind eye to Dr. Corey's testimony allegedly followed his advice on ivermectin for their own treatments. In a post by Dr. Corey on his Twitter account dated October 7, 2021, he alleged, quote, "Fun fact, between 100 and 200 U.S. Congress members, plus many of their staffers and family members, with COVID were treated by a colleague over the past 15 months with ivermectin in the iMask Plus protocol at flccc.net. None have gone to the hospital, just saying," end quote. Another similar story comes from a Reuters fact check, aka a Reuters lie, about an Australian news channel's coverage of the Queen of England's bout with COVID. The coverage featured a doctor who touted 2 new tablets and infusions, which in his words could make a dramatic difference to the welfare and health of sick and elderly people. While saying this, the network aired pictures of sotrovimab, a monoclonal antibody infusion, as covered, and stromectol, an ivermectin tablet. Reuters, along with other obedient propagandist networks, was quick to mention the Australian network in question later claimed it made an editing mistake. It apparently didn't mean to show ivermectin, so the fact-checkers claim there was no proof the Queen took the drug. The problem with this is several-fold. First, the doctor did himself mention a tablet, whether or not the footage was an error. None of the dishonest fact-checkers felt it necessary to mention this or identify which tablet he was talking about, if not ivermectin. Secondly, I thought sotrovimab wasn't a substitute for inoculation according to the FDA. In its blind focus on painting a specific picture, Reuters makes no attempt to dispute the infusion could save the life of an at-risk elderly person. If that's the case, what could possibly be the need to inoculate, especially assuming the Queen is inoculated? And third, if Reuters, a global media conglomerate, wanted to confirm what the Queen did take, it almost certainly could. The fact that it doesn't in what is already blatantly dishonest coverage seems to tell us everything we need to know as far as what the Queen took. So where are the calls for investigations into the FDA, NIH, and CDC from these congressmen, congresswomen, and the Queen? The same question is asked by Dr. Tess Lowry. Upon seeing Dr. Corey's testimony to the U.S. Senate, Dr. Lowry compiled a report of her own in January 2021 in which she took the time to assess the 27 studies cited by Dr. Corey in the FLCCC and to validate their findings. Upon validation via her own rapid review and meta-analysis, she ultimately submitted her report as well to the UK and WHO. The issue of why such a breadth of evidence is ignored and or so viciously discredited by those with conflicts of interest was also not limited to single scientists like Andrew Bryant. At times it infected the thinking of entire journals. In a February 2017 article entitled Ivermectin, enigmatic multifaceted wonder drug continues to surprise and exceed expectations, for example, Nature magazine hailed ivermectin's, quote, unexpected potential as an antibacterial, antiviral, and anti-cancer agent, end quote. Fast forward 5 years and Nature had a new mission, discrediting ivermectin while making no attempt to follow up on their own 2017 article which specifically acknowledged antiviral properties among other benefits. The problem with this sudden heel turn is that Nature shows its hand when it, in the same article questioning a single flawed ivermectin study, admits, quote, scientists worry that it will also be seen as an alternative to vaccines, which are highly effective, end quote. My questions for Nature, based on this absurd line, are as follows. Who exactly are these unnamed scientists of which you speak? What are their affiliations? Why is it not a problem that these scientists are so fixed on one possible solution, which is experimental and to date clearly demonstrates an absolutely absurd risk profile? What evidence do you have for this highly effective claim? Why do these scientists find it okay to have called brand new vaccines never before used in humans highly effective when the same types of trials you're demanding of the proven drug ivermectin, controlled randomized trials, haven't and can't have been completed for those vaccines? Why is the agenda of these scientists, whether a good thing or bad, more important or important at all relative to the experience and treatment decisions of medical doctors and scientists who disagree? Scientific studies get questioned and critiqued all the time, and that's a good thing. The problem in the COVID era is this has solely been a one-way street as far as policy implementation and enforcement. The agenda of the media's mostly unnamed scientists, as well as named figures like Andrew Bryant, has been clearly demonstrated in this book to have been considered a worthy excuse to justify lies, slander, and empty rhetoric during the past 2 years. Still, the amount of evidence for ivermectin's benefits has simply been too numerous for those agenda setters to keep up with. It is beyond doubt, and they know this. Beyond all the studies previously cited, there are also several anecdotal and epidemiological examples of countries and people apparently benefiting from the adoption of ivermectin as a primary treatment strategy. They are as follows. India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, eradicated its COVID case spike with adoption of universal ivermectin strategy. This also contrasts starkly with the Indian state of Kerala, which instead adopted a mass inoculation strategy in 2021, and despite only accounting for 3% of India's population, represented more than 65% of its COVID cases in September of 2021. Per LifeSite News, a December 2020 initiative in Mexico City to prescribe ivermectin and azithromycin to COVID-19 positive patients has resulted in a 52 to 76% reduction in hospitalizations in the city. A home treatment kit was created and used even in patients with no symptoms. Dr. Juan J. Jaime Quintero, a senior data analyst at private Columbian University EFIT, followed the trends as within 2 weeks of the regimen's introduction, hospitalization and deaths began to plummet. In fact, by February, Dr. Jaime Quintero noted a staggering 3,000 person decrease in weekly excess deaths. A 2020 study by Guerrero et al. In Columbia Medica compared data from 19 African countries which participated in the African Program for Onchocerciasis Control, APOC, from 1995 until 2015 to African countries which did not. A regression analysis, which controlled for different factors, found significantly lower mortality and case rates in APOC countries compared to non-APOC countries. As the APOC campaign included mass use of ivermectin, the authors hypothesized a role could have been played by the drug, which should be studied further. Buffalo News reported in January 2021 on an 80-year-old woman who was, quote, on a ventilator literally on her deathbed prior to her family convincing her doctors to try ivermectin. Her doctors previously gave her a 20% chance to live and told her family she'd likely be on a ventilator in the ICU for at least a month. With pressure from the family, her first doctor started her on the drug, but another doctor prevented further use. Thanks to this public health-fed dogma, the family was then forced to get a court order for the hospital to continue ivermectin treatment. The judge ultimately did provide the order, and with resumed treatment, the woman's health was soon restored, which her family attributed to what they called the miracle drug. While this is an anecdotal example, both the article and the doctors in the story demonstrate the absurdity of their aforementioned dogma by referring to ivermectin as experimental. This is a term never applied to their public health authorized drugs, i.e. remdesivir and gene therapy inoculations, which by any reasonable or honest standard are far more appropriately classified as experimental, both as treatments for this alleged novel disease and in general. So, given this bounty of support for positive treatment outcomes, why all the ivermectin slander? At worst, ignoring all evidence to the contrary for a moment, ivermectin doesn't treat the flu-like symptoms in question, but is a natural, cheap drug with noted benefits beyond those symptoms and has abnormally negligible risk profile. So why the need for the extra effort in discrediting it? Well, the answer is threefold. First, the financial conflicts of interest public health organizations have with the makers of the mRNA inoculations and of Gilead's remdesivir. We will summarize these in detail in a later chapter. Second, how those conflicts of interest contrast with the extremely low price of ivermectin. Unlike the mRNA inoculations and remdesivir, ivermectin was FDA approved prior to the alleged pandemic and has been since 1987. Israeli professor Eli Schwartz, founder of the Center for Travel Medicine and Tropical Disease at Sheba, conducted a randomized controlled double-blinded study of his own on the COVID usefulness of the drug from May 2020 through January 2021. What his study found was that ivermectin did have a, quote, almost 100% chance that a person will be non-infectious in 4 to 6 days. These findings were exciting to Schwartz when he considered the drug was as cheap as $1 a day in some places. However, despite his study, a lack of any evident side effects, the exceptional affordability, and sole prior approved status, Schwartz was disheartened by what he found to be senseless opposition and the lack of WHO support for even conducting their own trial. He voiced his discontent bluntly, quote, "We tried to publish it and it was kicked away by 3 journals. No one even wanted to hear about it. You have to ask how come when the world is suffering. This drug will not bring any economic profits," end quote, and so Big Pharma doesn't want to deal with it, he said. And the third reason to discredit ivermectin is the fact that it is, or was, considered solely an antiparasitic by the FDA. This third point might be the most important for their need to discredit the benefits of ivermectin. The FDA even unwittingly acknowledges this in their update, Why You Should Not Use Ivermectin to Treat or Prevent COVID-19. Thanks to the Wayback Machine, we can see an August 2021 screenshot of this same update included the line, quote, "Ivermectin is not an antiviral, a drug for treating viruses." The removal of this line in the current version reveals the profound implications that it presents. What the FDA surely by now knows, thanks to countless study demonstrations, is that ivermectin can be and is used as a treatment for the flu-like symptoms called COVID and would therefore be considered an antiviral. So this change needed to happen because they were faced with an impossible dilemma. First, if the August 2021 FDA claim was true that ivermectin cannot be successfully used against COVID because it's not an antiviral and COVID is caused by a virus, then its proven use and success implies COVID is not caused by a virus. Second, with the October 2021 deletion, the FDA unburdened itself from this previous issue. Such a deletion would also be easy enough to memory hole. Being aware of this deletion, however, as we now are, makes it clear there is no good reason for them to not have completed studies in 2020 on ivermectin which their deletion itself implies they know can treat the flu-like symptoms called COVID. The fact that even WebMD was acknowledging ivermectin's potential COVID benefits as early as April of 2020 makes the FDA's actions with regard to this drug all the more embarrassing and/or criminal. And this is where we close out our summary of ivermectin. The criminally corrupt FDA still, in October 2021, a year and a half after WebMD was acknowledging the potential benefits of ivermectin, admits, quote, clinical trials assessing ivermectin tablets for the prevention or treatment of COVID-19 in people are ongoing, end quote. They use the claim these mysterious trials are ongoing to make the demonstrably false claim that, quote, current available data does not show ivermectin is effective against COVID-19, end quote. And they make this demonstrably false claim as they sanction, via emergency use authorizations, expensive drugs and inoculations in as little as 2 days following the announcement, not even the publication, of NIH-sponsored, non-peer-reviewed studies like we saw with remdesivir in the previous chapter. They sanction these drugs which somehow, despite never being used in humans and not having prior FDA approval for any use, managed to allegedly complete safety trials before an available, cheap, approved, proven natural alternative. This is not believable, it is unethical, and it is a dereliction of duty which is either criminal or should be. Hydroxychloroquine bad because Orange Man bad. At the beginning of the alleged pandemic, hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ, was considered by the majority of polled physicians to be the most promising, effective candidate for both preventive and treatment purposes. And unsurprisingly so, considering its affordability, biological support, historical safety profile, previous use cases, and early use experiences of those very physicians. As the months wore on, randomized controlled trials were eventually conducted which seemed to show hydroxychloroquine didn't provide much benefit for hospitalized, severe conditioned patients. Still, debate continued as proponents claimed the purpose was intended primarily for early treatment to keep people out of hospitals and to be administered alongside a specific regimen not used in those trials. We will cover this debate shortly. While ivermectin's benefits are somewhat more clearly documented, what HCQ did have in common with that drug was the rabid, irrational vitriol it received from public health and its mainstream media attack dogs. And this early irrationality is the most important thing we will analyze in this section. Because while the unprecedented debate on HCQ effectiveness rages on to this day in the medical community, the immediate reflexive response to its initially suggested benefits created a controversy which, like for ivermectin, previously did not exist for this drug once widely considered to be one of the most ethical in existence. To demonstrate this irrational controversy, and as an early introduction to our upcoming chapter on political science, let us review an example of how utterly captured the CDC really is, which would be comical if it did not have life or death consequences. Quote, now, a drug called chloroquine, and some people would add to it hydroxychloroquine, so chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, it is known as a malaria drug, and it's been around for a long time, and it's very powerful. But the nice part is it's been around for a long time, so we know that if things don't go as planned, it's not going to kill anybody. When you go with a brand new drug, you don't know that that's going to happen. End quote. President Donald Trump, March 19, 2020. An astute point by the president, with a certainly reasonable cautious optimism about a drug being used by 6,200 surveyed physicians at the time. This assessment was not without some form of support either, as it seems to have come directly from a 100% treatment success rate reported at the time by Dr. Vladimir Zelenko. Zelenko's strategy was to use HCQ specifically alongside zinc and azithromycin, or AZ. HCQ was used because it helps zinc enter the cell as covered, which will then allow zinc to exercise its viral replication slowing properties. AZ was also used to prevent secondary bacterial infections. Dr. Zelenko's team treated all of their approximately 350 patients using this strategy. To be fair, Trump was almost certainly never clear about this important distinction that HCQ is to be used in sequence with AZ and zinc. There will also be additional blustery quotes an immature charlatan could or will find by Trump so they can cheer "told you so" like they love to do so much. The Trump-obsessed simply can't help themselves in this regard, and since blustery and absurd is what Trump has always been, letting this devolve to their level is pointless. But simply contrast this quote with Fauci's standard of care comment on remdesivir. Clearly a bigger story with bigger consequences given the unjustified FDA action 2 days later. Predictably, though, as was always the case with Trump, the vulture mainstream media responded by losing its collective mind, and HCQ became the mean orange man's drug from that point on. Quote, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has removed from its website highly unusual guidance informing doctors on how to prescribe hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, drugs recommended by President Donald Trump to treat coronavirus. The move comes 3 days after Reuters reported that the CDC published key dosing information involving the two antimalarial drugs based on unattributed anecdotes rather than peer-reviewed science, end quote. Reuters article, April 7, 2020. In this quote, Reuters proudly admits they shamed the CDC into altering its website language. I'm truly not sure what's more corrupt here. That Reuters tells the CDC what is highly unusual about what they published during an alleged once-in-a-century pandemic, or that the CDC actually considers Reuters its website's editor and makes the recommended change. At the same time, there's nothing surprising about either, given the actions of each organization throughout this time. What is confusing is why it would be a problem for the CDC to simply acknowledge what dosages real doctors, who are meant to have autonomy in the relationship between themselves and their patients, are using to treat their patients' conditions. The truth of the matter is, it wouldn't be, and as always with the corporate media, things get even more ridiculous. Quote, throughout the coronavirus pandemic, President Trump has embraced unproven treatments for coronavirus, especially anti-malaria drug hydroxychloroquine, which a new study found is linked to an increased risk of death in patients, end quote. Andrew Solander via Forbes, May 22, 2020. Knowing what we know about remdesivir and the refusal to investigate early treatments, I wonder what drug, if any, Solander considered proven in May 2020. Far more embarrassing than this politicking, though, is the failure of Forbes and Solander more than a year later to retract their note on the study they claimed linked hydroxychloroquine to an increased risk of death in patients. Simply following the link they provide to this study, one would see that it was retracted, and the circumstances and implications of this retraction are incredible. Only 2 weeks after the Forbes article, on June 4, 2020, The Guardian published a report on the retraction in which they identified inconsistencies in data and research misconduct. Specifically, the company that provided the data actually refused to cooperate with an independent audit. And unfortunately, the damage was already done, as the WHO's randomized controlled trials had already been stopped based on the publishing of this report alone. Still, several doctors recommend HCQ as part of their protocols and use it to treat. Their justification in doing so only seems to increase over time as well. For example, one November 2021 international multi-center randomized trial in Curious by Reed et al. Found a combination of HCQ, azithromycin, and zinc to be, quote, safe and effective in the treatment of COVID-19, with IV vitamin C contributing to a significantly quicker recovery, end quote. A running list has also been kept at the website C19 Early of 298 other peer-reviewed studies as of March 2022, including the note that HCQ and/or chloroquine have been adopted for early treatment by 36 countries, 53 including non-governmental medical organizations. Now, please understand, I'm not a treating physician recommending any medication. I don't take and currently have no intention of taking HCQ or any of the drugs mentioned in this book, other than daily vitamin D3, quercetin, and zinc supplements. To reiterate, the point of this section and of this entire book is simply to illustrate the corruption involved in the conflict which took place between those doing the authoritarian censoring and slandering and the damage it led to. And the story in this regard for HCQ is the same as it was for ivermectin, both previously approved and patent expired, so affordable, as well as anything else which didn't align with the goal of inoculations ultimately being the only universal solution. So with that out of the way, the following are public health ignored studies and findings supporting the use of HCQ. There's no good reason why this support and ongoing prescription activity by doctors wouldn't have warranted the same type of public health COVID use endorsement and availability received by an unapproved, worse risk profile, less evidence-supported drug like remdesivir, at least in the outpatient setting, and until randomized controlled trials could be done in that setting. First, Yale MD PhD Harvey A. Risch, May 2020 report in American Journal of Epidemiology found the following. HCQ plus AZ plus zinc combination widely misrepresented in both clinical reports and public media. 5 studies at the time, again, this was in May 2020, including 2 controlled clinical trials, had demonstrated significant major outpatient treatment efficacy, relatively low risk profile, and the recommendation of Risch's report was that these medications need to be made widely available and promoted immediately for physicians to prescribe. A 2020 study by Su et al. Published in Bioscience Trends measured the efficacy of HCQ at different stages of disease. It found use at an early stage, quote, decreased improvement time and duration of illness. A 2020 study by Ayerbe et al. Published in Internal and Emergency Medicine found significant association between treatment with HCQ and lower mortality. You will recall mortality was the original primary endpoint of Nyan's remdesivir study, which was revised once it became clear there was no association between remdesivir and reduced mortality. This provides more support that HCQ suppression costed lives. A 2021 multi-center observational study by Ip et al. In the BMC infectious diseases found an association between HCQ and a decreased rate of subsequent hospitalization. CDC scientists in 2005 even published findings in Virology Journal that chloroquine, of which hydroxychloroquine is a slightly milder derivative, is a, quote, potent inhibitor of SARS coronavirus. Consider this final note. The scientific community knew as early as 2005 that chloroquine was a potent inhibitor of the so-called SARS-CoV-1 virus, for which there is also little evidence of its existence, but this nonetheless supports the drug as a treatment for the associated symptoms. Given this, alongside the downright disastrous failure of remdesivir in the recent Ebola trials, corruption is the only possible explanation for why Anthony Fauci would fail to study HCQ as a primary candidate. Instead, he focused on remdesivir and then also slandered HCQ once it gained traction, something he did on CNN in May 2020, citing nothing but the promptly retracted Lancet study. Quote, the scientific data is really quite evident now about the lack of efficacy, end quote. Only a lack of efficacy wasn't evident at all at this time as it related to normal doses of HCQ, at least not nearly as evident as it had been with regular doses of remdesivir. Another excuse to call this common approved drug dangerous was a small study in which high doses of chloroquine, again, the more potent derivative of HCQ, were found to be linked to heart issues. This seemed a common theme too, as even in the randomized control trial mentioned at the beginning of this section, which found lack of benefit in the hospital setting, the starting dosage was 800 milligrams, almost double the daily maximum dosage recommendation in most nations of 500 milligrams. Yet, another particularly dramatic case of this was the UK recovery trial, which also found HCQ to have no benefit in hospitalized patients. This trial was itself also strangely found to have used almost 5 times the UK's own maximum daily dosage of 500 milligrams, giving patients a whopping 2,400 milligrams on the first day. And the only excuse given for this overuse was as follows. Quote, there's no recommended dosage for COVID-19 because it's a new disease, end quote. Again, this is an excuse which is so absurd that it has to be viewed as intentionally corrupt for a person to not instead conclude the medical community isn't utterly inept. Also, I'm not even shilling for HCQ here. In fact, this recovery trial makes it clear patients were inexplicably being given far more than the recommended maximum dosage of the drug. Therefore, I'd say it's very likely these experimental, hospital patient prescribed dosages also bore responsibility for some of the heart symptoms we've touched on being misattributed to COVID previously. And in an email, Yale epidemiologist Harvey Risch concurred. Quote, I agree about hydroxychloroquine overdosing, both from a reduced function point of view and toxicity, end quote. Before we conclude this section on HCQ, there is one more example I must share which perfectly captures the type of bold, flagrant, unprofessional behavior which characterized the overconfident public health officials of this time. In this instance, I am talking about Rick Bright, who was director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, until April 2020. Bright is relatively lesser known but plays an extremely prominent role in the COVID conspiracy, which we will highlight in the next chapter. For now, it must be pointed out that he was demoted from his role in April 2020, which he claimed was a retaliation due to President Trump not taking the pandemic as seriously as Bright thought it should be taken. Whatever the truth of that dispute was, Bright eventually told of how HCQ would factor into the equation in an interview during the anti-Trump propaganda film Totally Under Control. The narrator starts by absurdly claiming Donald Trump was, quote, reading from the Fox script in March 2020 when he discussed HCQ literally the most popular drug in use among physicians at the time. So, to be clear, my calling this film, which was released right before the election, propaganda was not hyperbole. That said, shortly before the narrator's reference to Fox News' coverage of the drug, Rick Bright was featured answering a question about how it came into the picture. Quote, I wish I had never heard of chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, honestly. End quote. Again, this is the director of the Department of Health and Human Services, BARDA, saying he wished he'd never heard of a drug which was tied in the past by CDC scientists to viral inhibition of the alleged SARS-CoV-1 virus. Bright says this in a documentary which is meant to criticize the response of an administration which acknowledged the potential of this drug he wishes he'd never heard of in the earliest months of an alleged pandemic for which there were obviously no drugs known to be effective. Somehow, despite this incompetent, childish response, Bright is meant to be presented here as the adult in the room who was dismissed for simply being too honest and scientific. The absurdity gets worse, however, when Bright describes just how little sense his opposition to the drug made. Quote, I believe it was March 23rd. I got a call from Secretary Azar's chief counsel. The White House wanted us to move quickly on making this drug available. I called my scientific team at BARDA and they said, no way. There was no data to support that they had any benefit against the coronavirus. They pushed back, but Dr. Unknown Name reiterated that directive to us and said, get on it, get it done. End quote. By all possible accounting of historical events, the above claim about there being no data to support is an outright lie. In fact, as of March 23, 2020, the only available data supporting the use of any drug for this purpose was on chloroquine from the 2005 study, HCQ from the observational testimonies of actually treating physicians, and the observational testimonies of other early treatment medications, also from actually treating physicians. As we covered previously, even Fauci's corrupt claims about remdesivir wouldn't come until the end of April. And as if this unprofessional liar could dig himself any deeper of a hole, he managed to when he admitted the compromise he made. Quote, we came up with the option of an emergency use authorization. We could put boundaries on it, restrict the drug to only be used in people who are hospitalized. And I was proud of our team for coming up with that compromise that we thought would protect Americans. End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you hubris. First of all, if Bright was so concerned that HCQ was dangerous to Americans, why the hell would he sign off at all on its use in the very setting where the most vulnerable Americans lay sick and dying? The man gets awfully emotional as he recalls his bravery for whistleblowing, so why didn't he just take his stand by refusing to sign off on any use of the drug he, quote, wishes he'd never heard of? Most importantly, though, recall the randomized controlled trials, which would ultimately, but hadn't even at that time in March, demonstrate HCQ was not effective in hospitalized severe patients. Especially considering the results of these trials, this compromise Bright was proud of proved to actually be a tremendous blunder. And it resulted only from his clearly political, immediate dismissal of HCQ as an outpatient treatment, which is what doctors were using it for, with some evidence of clinical success at keeping people out of hospitals at a time where there was no apparent alternatives. Instead, thanks to Bright's efforts, it would be restricted to hospitals, where it would be used at more than double the maximum dosage, and even more than that beyond the dosage doctors had been using it in the outpatient setting. And still, this HCQ debacle is only our introduction to Rick Bright, whose story of corruption gets way worse and makes his motivation for taking such an irrational stance on this issue very clear. In summary, I will again restate that I do not recommend, nor do I intend to use HCQ or any other medication mentioned in these chapters. I'm not a medical professional and am in no way providing medical advice. Still, it seems possible to likely that there could be some anti-inflammatory benefits to this drug, and it seems to have a much better risk profile than remdesivir when used in the proper dosage, the only way any drug should ever be used. The story of HCQ remains. Doctors continue to endorse it as a way to keep people out of the hospital, while corrupt liars obsessively oppose it. The latter also did so from the start, despite there being more prior evidence of its use for this very purpose than any alternative. So could HCQ have helped reduce hospitalizations if used correctly? The studies, physician testimonies, and reflexive reaction of corrupt public health departments suggest this could have been the case and could have saved lives had the corruption not been a factor.